And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Marshall Sonnenschein. We've had the great pleasure of having Marshall as a member of our faculty over the past 4 years with the M&A Advisor. He's been a tremendous collaborator with us on our Best Practices of the Best Dealmaker series, which expanded this year through our 4th edition with a focus on globalization and its effect on M&A, to the extent that we now have a readership nearing 500,000, and we are present in over 60 countries. And so with that, Marshall, I'll ask you to lead this esteemed panel in a dialogue about what globalization has in store for us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Nice to be with everybody. We have a great international panel in order to talk about the subject of cross-border deal-making. Not just deal-making, but the kind where you have people from different countries on the two different sides of the table. And that proves to be particularly important last year, which was the record year. Maybe the first quarter is a little soft this year, but last year was about $4.4 trillion in deals. You could actually afford to lose a third of $4.4 trillion and still be able to make a living with what's left. Cross-border was actually a significant, more significant than usual component of that $4 trillion worth of deals. And I don't think that's really changing. The panel that we have to talk about that are as international as it gets, and almost all of them are people that I've known for years. And you'll see when I say a couple of words about each how true that is. Starting at my extreme right, your left, is Florian Funk, who is one of the senior partners in EQT, one of the global private equity groups. Florian mentioned to me that he thinks his most significant fact about his professional life is that he has done private equity on 3 continents. And I said, well, those must be the Americas, Europe, and Asia. And he said, right, I got it. So I guess we're not doing too much in the Southern Hemisphere yet. But you will. I thought the most significant fact about Florian was that he, before EQT, he came from JP Morgan, and before that he was German, but I don't think you are anymore. I think it's over. Right. Greg Bedrosian is the managing partner of Redwood Capital, which is a TMT advisory firm and multifamily office and private equity group with particular emphasis on Europe, where Greg has long been a leader. And by that, he means both, as it used to be called, a sort of a quaint expression now, both Europe and Old Europe, which is really New Europe, meaning Central and East Europe, and was one of the founders of Renaissance Capital, which for many years was the forerunner to that business. Just as the wall in Berlin was falling, Greg was there doing deals, I guess. That's about as international as it gets. Selig Sachs in this organization needs almost really no introduction to anybody because he's such an insider to the discussions and has long been, particularly on China. Selig is from Stanford Law School. He's co-head of global practice at Foley & Lardner, and I think it's fair to say he has more experience in China than most Chinese people at this point. I think he goes back and forth more often than anybody else from the billion people that are there would ever go back and forth. Harvey Fine is truly the internationalist, not because he just completed a very substantial tour of duty with Fosun, one of the leading global investors of China, not because he has a long and proud history in private equity deal making generally, not just because he is one of the board observers of Cirque du Soleil, although that makes him particularly colorful, but he's from a foreign country altogether called Hawaii, which I think is so American now that it might as well be the 51st state, but he tells me it's one of the 50, and I didn't know that. Satish is up next and is from the very robust firm of Sutherland Global. I did not know this, but Sutherland really spun out of Xerox as a business process outsourcing, sort of an Accenture-type organization. Many of you here know the company. I did not. And I asked him, well, how many people does Sutherland have dotted around the world? And they're literally around the world. They're in 20 countries. And he said 44,000. And I said, that's a good-sized firm. He said, it's okay. It's growing. It only spun out maybe in the mid-'80s. Yep. And Satish is from India. They cover everything from technology to finance to other pieces of the management value chain for global organizations all over the world. And that's about as global as it gets. And finally, my new friend, Charles Otton, who is co-head of industrials at UBS, British by background, which is not really a foreign country if you're American, but has more experience covering large cap deals than I think most people his age. Most people his age are surprised that he's still doing it. But he told me yesterday over the phone that he's been doing it for 21 years, and I did not mention, well, I've been doing it for 30, so I'm even more ridiculous now. But we're as hardworking, I guess, as it might get. I thought the deal that was worth mentioning was AerCap buying ILFC from AIG, and I was all excited about that because I sold ILFC to AIG 20 years ago, which meant that he beat me to the second assignment on that one. But it turns out that he thinks the more significant deal to mention is Alaska Air and Virgin. And I said, well, that's sort of international. We're doing an international panel because Virgin is British. And he said, yeah, well, it's really an American deal, but mention it anyway. So I'm mentioning it. He did the Virgin deal. And there you have it. So very global panel. I'm going to throw out a few questions and see what these globalists have to say about them. But I want to start with the most basic, which is why is cross-border so important now? And what is cross-border when you really step back and evaluate what it means? Obviously it means parties from two sides of two different countries, but why has that grown so much and why is that such an important topic now? And as I do at Harvard Law School, where you are allowed to call on your students, I'm calling on Selig first. He went to law school, he can tolerate this.
It's a good thing I read the syllabus last evening.
Right.
Well, you know, it's interesting. One of the things that Select USA mentions in terms of inbound to the United States is that 20% of all goods and products that are manufactured in the United States are owned or controlled by companies that are located outside the United States. So really, we've always been positioning ourselves in the U.S. as a country that is receptive to investment by others. And you know, A.T. Kearney, for example, rates the United States, again, for the third or fourth year in a row, as the most favorable or sought-after destination. Even with Chinese investors, 46% view the U.S. as the favorite place of investment, although you have the issue of regulatory concerns, which we'll talk about later. But this is all part of the whole globalization phenomenon, where emerging nations are looking for access to markets for their products, and also access to technology that they can bring and deploy within their country themselves. So, for example, if you're a car maker, and if you're a Japanese car maker like SAIC, Shanghai Auto, and Yangfan is one of their subsidiaries, if you're in the interior business of making automobiles and you're responding today to RFPs, you're responding on a global basis. And therefore, you'll have operations in the United States, not only your R&D center and your headquarters in the Detroit area, but in Kansas, Texas, elsewhere, where the OEMs are actually manufacturing as well. So you're looking then at capital-seeking destinations where it can realize the highest return, and you're looking for innovation and access to technology, and you're looking for access to markets. So I think these are some of the themes that are really driving this huge propulsion towards globalization. And I think globalization in 2015, I think about $1 trillion of the $4 trillion represented cross-border M&A. And as David Fergusson was mentioning, that phenomenon is only going to continue to grow in terms of the cross-border aspect, looking at the statistics just from the first quarter alone.
And thinking about the globe, where is cross-border now? I mean, maybe global M&A is down. Cross-border will continue to be a significant component. But where are the important hotspots for cross-border activity? And Florian, since you mentioned doing deals on 3 continents, you must have some view on what's important right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe let's start first with the term cross-border. I want to actually challenge if the term cross-border is still relevant in today's world. We as a private equity firm, we were founded in Stockholm. Our investor base is truly global, from Asia through Europe, through North America, Canadian pension funds. A lot of money is coming from the US, which is pooled into the funds, and then they go out and invest in companies in certain countries across the globe. So the question to me is, are we speaking just about international M&A actually maybe? And cross-border is maybe more a way to come up with statistics in order to tell a story. Of course, it's more driven by strategics investing across countries. But I think that would be basically a question also to my co-panelists here. Is cross-border the term which we should use in 2016 going forward, or is it another term we should look for? And then I just want to compliment what Selig said. I think it's looking for growth, being it a private equity investor or a corporation. And each of them is looking for growing companies themselves. So what are the hot topics? It will remain Asia, but I think a lot of attention is coming to the US actually, especially out of Europe, but also out of Asia, because it seems to be one of the most solid markets in order to grow for the next decade, while China is slowing down a little bit from the stellar growth rates previously, and Europe is still looking to find a way forward, although it has stabilized from my point of view the last couple of months. So it's really about finding pockets of growth and technology. We just very recently sold a very successful investment out of Germany to China. Was an energy to waste facility, and there was a lot of interest from Chinese buyers who were looking for the technology. But the perception in Germany over the last couple of 10 years, I would say, has changed dramatically towards Chinese buyers. So there's a big openness actually by the management teams as well to partner up with such a buyer, because they are allowed to grow the business, but have additional avenues of growth in front of them.
One might even pause on whether we need the word cross-border anymore. When I started in this business many decades ago, as I mentioned, you'd make a list of buyers for any company that you would be representing to sell, and that list would typically be divided on two different axes. Strategic and financial was the first axis, and domestic and international was the second. But I think today you're right. I think that those are almost antiquated approaches, because really the only axis that matters, that drives all of this, is strategy. You don't really look at private equity firms. You look at their portfolio companies and ask yourself the question, where is a strategic fit? You don't really care whether the company is owned by the public or by some private group of investors. What you're looking for is strategy, because that is where the deal is likely to happen. In a sense, the M&A market has become so efficient that now we are all forced to be strategists for real, because otherwise you won't find the right deal. I want to look a little bit to my left and ask the question, what makes the the process of doing cross-border work a special skill set nonetheless? Why is it a breed apart when you get into the arena and are dealing with parties from different countries? What happens?
I think one of the definitions that you brought up about globalization is that the reason why we have cross-border deals is that businesses become much more global. So as Florian said, these deals are happening driven by a certain strategy, a certain growth strategy, where you're now mirroring, you're partnering resources with markets that otherwise in the past wouldn't be able to happen. 5 years ago, probably wouldn't have been possible for a Chinese investor to acquire that kind of technology in Germany and bring it to China. At the same time, a German company alone probably wouldn't be able to do it. So you're bringing those two supplies and demands together in order to access it. Now that requires a certain sort of skill set that allows a Chinese company, in the case of Florian's portfolio company, to be able to work with a German company, to navigate the regulations in Germany, but also to be able to take that technology and access the Chinese market, which is different than a Chinese company doing it themselves, because you have to adapt it to that ecosystem. I think the deal making requires not only the legal expertise and the financial expertise, but the relationships between those countries to be able to facilitate some success. Otherwise, you've seen in the past when these cross-border deals have been attempted and failed, it's because one or two of those elements weren't in place.
Charles, depending on how the vote goes, Britain may actually be a foreign country from Europe. And I know you've been stomping around that territory for a long time, so tell us how this is a different breed in this area of practice.
Well, Florian made a great point about cross-border being perhaps a slightly out-of-date concept. As I look at cross-border, you have different types of cross-border transactions. I think the cross-border transactions with a Canadian company is a fundamentally different concept than that which takes place with a Chinese company. And actually, interestingly, this quarter, I think most of the volume of cross-border has actually come from those two countries. About 83% of the cross-border activity this year has come from those two countries, most of which is actually Canadian. When you ask the question about why is it growing, why is cross-border happening, what are we seeing now that we perhaps weren't seeing 20 years ago? For me, I think there's a lot of pressure in the boardroom to look at international deals. I think a lot of strategic buyers have almost run out of domestic opportunities here in the US. You see the regulator, I know we'll get onto this a little bit later, but blocking certain deals which are just seen to be too anti-competitive. Certainly it's a big factor in the way in which we throw ourselves into transactions.
Regulatory issues have become more front and center. You could see it in three different areas. One, of course, right now is tax inversions, in which the Obama administration has made absolutely clear this time around that they're going to put some teeth behind Treasury regs that would get in the way of that. Another is antitrust, in which the Justice Department has made clear now that they have a real problem with Baker Hughes and Halliburton getting together. It took them a long time to make that decision, and now I guess it's going to be litigated. And that after seeing a round of antitrust enforcement actions against mergers that we really had not seen very much of at all in the first decade. And then thirdly, CFIUS, which is in many ways the hardest to predict. They just blocked a $3 billion deal from Phillips. So this whole subject of regulation seems everywhere present, and it has real international overtones. Where does that affect our lives as practitioners?
Deal making per se has become borderless. Companies per se are obviously more global today than they were, a couple of decades, 3 decades ago. But I think cross-border is still an applicable term only because of what the regulators have done, which is they're now raising the borders high up with these kind of regulations, whether it's CFIUS or the enforcement of CFIUS, which actually was, signed into effect by President Ford, I think, in 1975.
Was it that old?
Yeah, but bear in mind at that point in time, the amount of available capital outside of the U.S. for them to buy into the U.S. Was not that much. So it was more a deterrent from, as you rightly said, Russia or any of the other countries kind of coming in and taking control over here. But now with the balance of trade having shifted so dramatically, and there's visibility and awareness to companies on all sides of the map, if you will, and capital coming into the U.S., it's become a lot more relevant now. Lenovo is a classic example, that it had to go all the way up to the Oval Office for it to be signed before they could buy IBM over here. So unfortunately, deal making has become a little more complex. It is still cross-border because of these complexities that have been put up by whether it's the tax guys or whether it's the legal guys in the U.S. But also bear in mind that there are reciprocal effects, whether it's in China or India, where they have their own, albeit nascent, antitrust laws and anti-competition laws and foreign investment prevention laws as well. So that's become, it's become a lot more complex today, at least in my context, because not only do I have to worry about Hart-Scott over here or the DOJ over here, but if I buy a company overseas, I have to deal with that situation over there as well, because then when we ask them, this is actually going to help you guys for us to be able to buy, and they're saying, oh, no, we need to make sure that there's no monopoly that's created over here, because your country is telling us when we're trying to put money in over there, they're going to evaluate us by the same standards.
What is often surprising is when you see, if you went back 25 years ago, it was the European Union that blocked the merger between GE and Honeywell, those two U.S. companies. And CFIUS actually acted, as I said a moment ago, on a national security question involving Phillips, which is technically a European country, although I get it that the assets they were selling were here. Wasn't obvious that it was national security, so you get some surprises. You probably see some of it, Satish, in the world of data, which is a big part of, I guess, Sutherland's practice.
Data in today's world where technology is so pervasive, there is a fair amount of focus on privacy laws, on data laws, on where the data is housed, even though it may be accessed globally. But those laws still aren't that mature because people are still trying to figure out what the flow of information is. No one's really able to pinpoint saying where does the data reside, to where is it being processed, to where is it being accessed, and where along that continuum is it likely to be compromised. So that's still evolving, but I think a large part of it is structural and, as you said, people kind of draping the flags around themselves, which, is not a bad thing, but, shouldn't become par for the course when dealing with, higher bars today.
We've just concluded, 25 rounds of bilateral investment treaty, BIT, negotiations with China. And we're looking and asking them to kind of narrow their negative list even more, because our definition of national security here in the United States is much more focused on that subject as opposed to economic security, which obviously has a more indirect impact on national security itself. Why is China, the number one now in CFIUS review, followed by Canada and the UK? And by the way, if you add their review, it's probably equal in size to that of the Netherlands and Germany. If you put those two together, it's because there's far more acquisition by China here now in the United States, and it's becoming much more technology-oriented as well. So when we speak about CFIUS, we should realize that the vast majority of transactions do get done. And it's not a, yes, there have been certain transactions now that have not been approved by CFIUS. So for example, even on international transactions, CFIUS will look at it. So when CNOOC bought Nexen in Canada, 12% of their assets were in the Gulf area. And there was issue of proximity to military bases there and sensitive technology. So non-public agreements were executed with CNOOC relative to the management and control of those facilities itself. So if it has a U.S. component, you talked about the 30 years ago, and the same name appeared then as appeared in February, Fairfield. CFIUS really was ramped up 30 years ago when Fujitsu was making an offer for Fairfield. And lo and behold, again, now you had a Fairfield doing a deal with ON Semiconductor, and then an unsolicited bid by China Resource Holdings, which was even going to pay the $79 million breakup fee. But then Fairfield abandoned or did not consider it because they were concerned about CFIUS. So the whole issue of national security is really an evolving concept. It's there. I don't think it's necessarily a deal breaker. I think, as Steve Klemenczyk this afternoon, who prepared the military assessments for our U.S. government as part of the CFIUS process before joining PwC, this afternoon he'll be talking about it on the panel. But I think we have to put CFIUS in a proper context itself. Having said that, the ISS deals, the OmniVision technology deals, they were approved last year. So, and also, when Ombong was making its bid for Starwood, there was some concern saying, well, are we entering into a new period also of CFIUS review in terms of data aggregation? That after the breach of security from the Office of Personnel Management of the U.S. government, where millions of detailed files on federal employees were pirated, not for commercial exploitation, but perhaps for other purposes. When you are buying companies such as Starwood, and you have all this data about government and other individuals who stay at your hotels, do you reach another level of review, based upon data and the use of that data itself? So that's an invitation actually to come to our panel today at 2:30. So Steve will be speaking on those issues itself.
Are you talking about where our government employees are, or who they're with when they go to these hotels? So, Greg,
and what they are watching in the privacy of the rooms.
Greg, you were really we talk about China a lot today, but you were in a very different market of controversy and uncertainty in the early 90s, right after the Berlin Wall came down, and you were a pioneer doing deals in formerly communist countries. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Sure. So, in that environment, a lot of what was transacting in the 90s were privatizations of resource-heavy businesses, some of them to market insiders, some of them to international energy companies and the like. What we have seen more so in those markets today, again, has been a shift more to the intellectual property side of transactions, where very strong, whether it be East European or Russian technology companies, software developers, many large public companies, Yandex and a few others, are multi-billion dollar groups, are now starting to look at acquisitions in Europe and in the U.S. In terms of some of the elements around that you were talking about in terms of government involvement and barriers. Certainly, Russia, especially, and for those in the audience who've been involved in transactions, is notoriously one of the most opaque and complex parts of the world to successfully get transactions done. And as a result, if one looks at the statistics of transactions outside of the energy sector relative to private equity investing or cross-border M&A, the numbers are sparse compared to other markets of like population. And so I think what that does say is, especially again in an intellectual property-focused acquisition strategy, acquirers have a choice. And if a region does make an acquisition too complex, one can always look elsewhere. In technology, if the business is based in Silicon Valley or Stockholm or Shanghai, it's really about the team and what technology is being acquired. And if it's certainly easier to make an acquisition in one of those markets versus, say, Russia, where I have and continue to do a lot of work, capital will follow. And so
after Russia, what are the most robust centers of M&A activity in the Central and Eastern European countries?
Well, it is somewhat sector dependent, and within Central and Eastern Europe, I mean, the population size of those regions drop off dramatically. So one isn't really buying, the 10 million consumers in a small Eastern European country versus 200 million plus in Russia. So it's not a consumer play. It then ends up being more of an intellectual property play. And Poland especially, and others, there's a lot of high quality businesses of global caliber, and some that are emerging that we see as an area of increased focus.
Do you mean businesses, not only businesses that others might want to acquire, but are Polish companies big enough to be buying businesses in Europe?
Yes. Correct. Yeah.
So I'm mindful of the fact that 3 of our 6 panelists today are European, and I want to ask the question, is Europe recovering, or is Europe in for a very long slog of the type that we have sadly witnessed in Japan for now 20 years of recessionary behavior? Where is Europe? Charles, you have to start. You're British. You have to jump in.
So, obviously, what's happened in certain parts of Europe is very troubling. So, Greece has perhaps been the bad scenario for us if we're Europeans, and we've seen some of the political and some of the political reaction to that. I think if we talk about Europe developing into what Japan has become, which is a very mature economy, very wealthy economy with maybe an overvalued currency, the glass is half full version of this for M&A practitioners is that there should be a fair amount of acquisition activity conducted by European firms into other parts of the world. And we've seen some of that certainly led out of Japan, and we would obviously want to encourage that. I think the British situation is very complex. I think nobody will know where that lands for a while, and we've seen that play out in the press. We certainly see, I think, some envy in Europe around the simplicity of doing business in the US and certainly other newer geographies. So I think it's very tough to see big inbound US into Europe acquisitions in the short term with that level of uncertainty, although we certainly have our fair share that we have in the shadow pipeline. But pound for pound, I think people would rather put their money to play in the US or maybe China.
And Florian, it's often said that your home country of Germany is the strongman of Europe. That may be true, but is it the strongman only in relative terms, or is it actually a strong growing economy now?
Yeah, I guess the data make it challenging to argue for a strong growing economy. But maybe in terms of Europe, you can also take a step back and just look what drove the strong growth coming out of the global financial crisis. And certainly China was a big driver of German economy, given the very successful export business a lot of machinery companies had out of Germany, which of course provided for a super cycle you can actually argue for, and that is of course coming down now. Germany, with the largest population in Europe, is of course an important driver of the continent, and driving a lot of cross-border business between the European countries as well. I'm more concerned about like the political leadership landscape in Europe for the next 10 years. I'm seeing, unfortunately, as in other countries, a lack of talent. And a lot of very good efforts were done in Germany 10 years ago from a social democratic government back then, which freed up the labor market, which drove really innovation and growth in Germany, which in turn spilled over into other countries. From our perspective, in terms of deal making, our view is we need to be macro aware but micro focused. So we are very active in doing deals across Europe. We opened just up an office in Spain. We see that country recovering. We start to look very actively at deal opportunities in Italy. So there are other countries which really are able to produce and have great companies we want to invest in because we see the growth opportunity for that particular business. And part of that is also that access to technology has become so easily available. So we are very active investors in the technology space and the software space. And we don't look at like countries where the company is operating in, but really at the technology and the USP and the differentiated product and service that they are offering to their customer base.
You mentioned Sweden in your opening remarks, and I think you were referring to the Wallenberg family, who are anchor investors in EQT.
Yep.
And Sweden, a little bit like Canada, I suppose, has always been a center for commerce and international activity. I'm doing a deal right now in Sweden with the Chinese party, and it is a clash of cultures to do these things.
Yeah.
The Swedes are very predictable. The Chinese are not in the deal context. Let's talk a little bit about China. Is it a growth engine? I'm asking this to my whole panel. Is it a growth engine? Is it a black box? Or is it an economic powder keg? What is it? Harvey, you just spent a tour of duty working with Fergusson. You have to have a view on this.
I do. Rumors of its death are greatly exaggerated. Right? It's not the dire situation that people make it out to be. But I do think it's a little bit of all three, what you're saying. On the black box side of it, certainly there's a question about the reliability of the data that's coming out. So in that sense, it is a black box. I think the second part of that is there's also a difficulty in understanding what the government is going to do when it comes to things that will drive the economy, including the renminbi, including where investment is going to be, including allowing cross-border investments, both outbound and inbound. I think when it comes to the growth engine, it will continue to be a growth engine because it's still growing faster than most economies, but it's not going to be the aggregate macro growth that people have been used to over the past, call it 10 years, where you place a bet on a certain sector in China and the rising tide makes all boats go well. It's going to be much more targeted in services sectors rather than industrial. Businesses with capital investment, I think, are going to grow at much slower rates. And cities that have that same driver will have a tough time growing. But secondary cities that are still growing on the services side will continue to outperform, and they will get closer to 10% growth versus the 3 or 4 or 5% growth that other cities in China will be growing.
I was at a meeting recently. A great Chinese economist named Yukon Huang from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which I'm very involved in, gave a presentation that was basically making the case that it's not so bad. And when he was all done with his presentation, I said, Yukon, your data, your arguments are very cogent, but your data all derives, as it inevitably must, from the Chinese government, and so you're depending on their data for your argument. And he said, well, yes, that's true, and that is an Achilles heel of my argument. I said, an Achilles heel is kind of it's a serious problem because we don't really. And was I being a provocateur unreasonably, or is it actually true that we may not know today what is inside China because we have to rely on data that may or may not be accurate and that the government itself may or may not know is accurate? Is that possible? Or is that an unreasonable position? Am I going to get shot after that? Am I going to end up in cement boots?
No, I think that is the issue. It's the issue of transparency. And the government is really is walking that line of wanting to. They realize they must encourage innovation. The whole 13th five-year plan is all about innovation, and yet at the same time, they're restrictive on the flow of information. So everybody's trying to figure out what the actual numbers are. Electric grid utilization and output is one of the factors people look to, and others. Is the real growth 3%? Is it in the 6 range? I mean, China is on a tear to essentially double per capita GDP by 2020 over levels of 2010. I think, as Harvey says, there are many economies in China, and I think it's going to be more the dartboard, and you have to be more exacting in terms of the areas you're focusing on. And there are going to be, and there are ebbs and flows in terms of capital outflow, because the RMB relative to the dollar now, at least for the moment, the foreign reserves of China actually increased now modestly for the first time in 5 months, so it's at $3.21 trillion, as of the end of March. So people are now talking, well, the RMB looks like it is stable, but people are concerned about the RMB, and it's hard to make investment decisions. I was working on deals in January where we were essentially told, withdraw from the bidding. We have to withdraw because the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, SAFE, has told us that they're not going to allow us to effectively invest at the moment.
Well, that's what appears to have happened with Anbang and Starwood. It seems to me that the government told Anbang, get out.
Well, that's it. There's a problem there, I think, because yes, I did hear when I was in China that government officials were not too, certain government agencies were not too happy with Anbang having made that bid without, in their view, proper pre-clearance itself. It doesn't help the market when a company like Anbang makes such a public display, and then when their bid is topped, then just issues a statement that it's withdrawing because of, quote, market conditions. So what does that do for the deal environment itself? It means that that bankers and companies are then calling clients that I work with and saying, well, can we really rely on you? Is your bid going to be a firm bid? And then you have to give the reassurance. Yes, we have money already offshore. Yes, this has been approved. That has been approved. But I think it's a lesson for us here. There isn't just one monolithic Chinese investor. And I think companies that are looking to attract Chinese purchasers need to kind of understand who they are dealing with. Are they dealing with an SOE? Are they dealing with a POE, a privately owned enterprise, or a SME? The dynamics are different. And we have seen a fundamental evolution as to who the Chinese buyer is right now. So, for example, in 2015 in the United States, 56% of buyers from China to the U.S. were private equity firms, they were insurance companies, they were financial conglomerates. You have a maturation of PE and otherwise in China where the skill sets are there. So aggregators of capital, similar to our PE industry here, are now being more assertive on a global basis as well. So I think you have an evolving type of situation itself, and there are so many different players, and some are regulated and some are not regulated, that you really need to take into account the specific circumstance of each particular buyer in determining the likelihood that a transaction will be executed.
Well, I want to leave a couple of moments on those themes for maybe people in the audience to respond, Celia, to what you just said and to what others have said. We haven't gotten to the subject of corruption, and it's hard to talk about being a globe-trotting deal maker and doing business in lots of countries without getting onto that. Satish, I know that if you're dealing with companies in 20 different countries, you've seen a few issues along the way, and you probably have clients that need your help in navigating data or government or regulatory issues that have issues in them of corruption. We live in a world that has it. So somebody here should ask Satish about corruption, because I want the audience to ask questions. And by the way, I reserve the right to call on people out there also. That's just what I do. So who has a question for Satish about corruption? Somebody must have a question here.
Yeah.
I think a government corruption Marshall is talking about. I mean, it's a serious problem. I see right here New York City planning out, and then I've always thought it was a poverty. If you look at the mirror here, we have some serious issues at every level.
That's true. I don't think the notion that corruption is a foreign concept is true at all. It exists globally.
But we like to think that in this country. It's what we like to think.
Yes, it's,
That's our propaganda
I
committee.
certainly appreciate
Right.
that point of view. It's the levels of corruption and the pervasiveness, especially from the top, and what permeates across multiple regulatory agencies or compliance agencies in a country that makes it more difficult. In this country, to your point, Marshall, it's in select pockets. It's not all pervasive yet. It's not a systemic problem. But there are countries where it is a systemic problem. Navigating that for us, setting up businesses for our own selves over there is a problem, but then helping clients navigate as they set up over there. It's become a lot better now than it was, I'd say, about 15 years ago when we first set up shop globally outside of the US in India. It was a whole different ballgame than it is today. It's become, I think, as the world opened up, it's become less corrupt on a global basis. But when you're trying to, in my world, trying to get a deal done, so basic organic work by nature is less prone to corruption than the kind of work that I do, which is either making investments or buying companies, where there's always the potential upside factor and someone wants a piece of that action. So it is dark, muddy waters that one needs to carefully navigate that I practically see on an everyday basis.
I've pushed Charles on Brexit. I've pushed Florian on whether Germany's really the strong man. I want to push you a little bit on this problem in India, where you came from originally. And I know you must have clients there, and you're competing with great business process outsource providers from India. India is famous for a court system where it takes 10 years to just get on the docket unless you know the judge. What is India going to do about this problem? And is it, in fact, slowing down its economy?
It certainly is, and 10 years is a very optimistic view. It's
I was trying to be a diplomat. I know it's longer.
Legal problems are generational in nature in India. What your granddad started off, your grandkids probably going to know the result of. So it's it kind of spans that. I think it is largely a very basic problem of the level of literacy in the country, the level of qualified people to do that work. The court system, the infrastructure is not geared up for a country of 1.2, 1.3 billion people. It just doesn't exist today. I think the same problem at a systemic level exists in pure infrastructure, whether it's roads, ports, airports, anything that you need for the growth of the economy. So a lot of the economic growth that will happen, at least over the next 5-10 years, the way the current government's looking at it, will be domestic, India for India. The notion of Indian companies buying abroad or foreign companies making investments over there will all still be peripheral to the actual growth that is going to be domestic consumption and demand and supply that's created over there. The literacy levels are up by a factor of about 20-30% over the last 10 years. The court systems are being beefed up. There are more appellate and subjudicial courts that have come up over there. But it's still not enough. It's still not enough because the backlog of cases, I think the oldest recorded case that's still being litigated in a civil court in India is from 1962. So we're talking a fair bit of time.
Well, I want to give the last brief word to Charles, but only after first asking Greg, back in your days in Central Europe, these countries were becoming capitalist in real time and you were watching it unfold. Were you seeing the dying embers of corruption or the emergence of a new class of capitalist corruption? What were you seeing on this axis?
I think that, briefly, the fundamental view, and a lot of great Harvard economists and others were advising the vibrant government of Russia in that period, and one looks and says, how are there 15 Russians that are worth 10 billion or more? Like, what did they do in like 12 years? Like, they must be really, really strong entrepreneurs. Well, what happened was, and it was, by the way, a U.S. free market privatization system that was recommended to the government to say, give every citizen a voucher worth 10,000 rubles. You can go and actually invest in the factory you work in or the company that you're involved in. the reality was what, frankly, a lot of the U.S. Advisors were naive about is these individuals grew up under a totalitarian regime in the Soviet Union. They didn't trust a 10,000 ruble privatization voucher. They thought it was a scam, somehow to trick them. So you then had a bunch of well-connected, maybe more commercially minded people, many who became oligarchs, who said, well, I'll just buy up all these privatization vouchers and end up acquiring what ended up being at very, very low valuations, some of the most valuable resources and assets in the world. And is that, where along the corruption versus opportunism spectrum does that lie? I'll leave that to the audience to form their own.
A couple of years ago, I had a bidder for an American company that was one of the oligarchs. And when I thought to myself, well, if he wins, he didn't win, but if he wins, I'm going to have to file an AML, an anti-money laundering report. And I asked myself, well, where's his money from? And all I could find in his background was that he had been a government civil servant. So, just saying. Charles, I know you have some good gem of British witticism and wisdom for us to close our panel.
Well, as I listen to a lot of the themes here, particularly about regulation and corruption, I think one point that we haven't talked about, and it's not a very long point, but it's a crucial part of M&A, is the ability to finance deals. And you asked earlier, I think, yes. how does what we're seeing in the regulatory, all these different regulatory environments affect how we as practitioners conduct our life? Both regulatory risk and corruption risk, I think, are creeping into the way in which organizations like ourselves back and are willing to help finance buyers of large assets. So it may well be that a company who is very comfortable buying an Indian asset that maybe has some litigation stretching back to 1962, that may well be very comfortable and a risk that the equity provider is prepared to take. I think for us, we have noticed increasingly the regulatory risk and the corruption risk creeping into our considerations about what situations we're prepared to back. Just in the same way you wouldn't go shopping without knowing that you have access to a credit card or to a full wallet. I think what's happening now is that those things are being addressed up front and maybe being dealt with by increasingly large breakup fees or ways to get companies very comfortable that they're dealing with a real buyer. But that is a real practical way that we are running into these issues as a large bank.
A wonderful point to end on. So I want to thank Charles Otton, Satish Raman, Harvey Fine, Selig Sachs, Greg Bedrosian, and the strongman of Europe, Florian Funk, and all of you for being a good audience and making it possible for us to have a conversation that I hope was stimulating. Thank you all very, very much.